Hello, I'm Carol Smaldino. Welcome to The Human Climate. My guest today is James Trainum. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I knew of you as an ex-detective when I read an interview in the Washington Post, and I read about the fact that you personally had been involved in a wrongful conviction. Is that right?
Not quite. Close though.
Okay.
I actually got a false confession that led to an arrest.
Okay. A false confession. Now, when I started the podcast, I actually was interested in meeting up with some people who had done some things they weren't so happy about. I mean, in the field, for example, and I'm not equating this, but in the field of military torture, which is an interest of mine, I have been interested actually in meeting up with some soldiers who were kind of mesmerized by the anger and resentment enough to commit acts of torture. And I know that there are many who have felt what's known as, moral injury, that they've felt bad about it. But there's not a market, so to speak, to have these people come forward because the general public is often not at ease with the fact that we have committed torture because we think of it, all right, many Americans think of it as a necessary evil and nothing to be ashamed about. I don't feel that way, but uh, in any case, when I knew I was going to be interviewing or having as a guest Steve Drizin, and I had gotten, I don't know, I guess to be a beginning law student without the credentials in this particular field, because, I had watched a number of documentaries. I had listened to many of their podcasts, him and Laura Nyrider, and who was his student and then became his associate. And so when I read about you, I thought, wow, this is a chance to really understand some of the dynamics of someone who has been involved. And, you were a detective and now you have your own organization to help people navigate the criminal justice system. And so I wonder if we could start, if you could tell me your story. And you said I could call you Jim.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Well, I mean, my story is pretty much on the same track as a lot of detectives. I became a uniformed officer back in 1983, and basically, I bought into a lot of the Kool-Aid that surrounds law enforcement. That we're the good guys, and that we're out there to, you know, rid the world of evil and all that. However, I was a bit more, I think, liberal than a lot of my associates were, even though I still had some fairly conservative views. I went through several very, very intense investigative units. I worked on a lot of different cases, types of investigations, until I went to homicide as a detective back in 1983. And during that time, I also received training in the standard, interrogation tactics that were being taught across the country. One of the specific things was what's called the Reed technique, and that's pretty much standard
Yeah.
for
That's,
all.
I'm sorry, that's REE. How do you spell that
It's
for people?
REID,
Okay.
and basically, it's an accusatory approach to interrogation. And there's a lot of schools that teach this accusatory approach, but it's all based on what the Reed people have developed and have taught since like the 1940s. So it was around 1994. I had a very high-profile homicide case in which a government worker was kidnapped, driven around. His credit cards were used. His ATM card was used, and he was later found beaten to death. Well, it turns out that he apparently had a secret life that, of course, makes any investigation much more difficult. So we were hitting a lot of dead ends. We published a composite drawing of a woman who was known to have used his credit cards and a very, very bad ATM photograph of the woman as well. And what happened then is what happens a lot in wrongful conviction cases is we started working backwards. Rather than following the evidence, we began to have a tip-driven investigation where we were getting tips. Hey, that looks like so-and-so. So we were trying to fit so-and-so into the evidence rather than see if the evidence took us to this person. Well, we identified this one person in particular through a couple of tips that seemed interesting for many reasons. And we were able to obtain samples for handwriting from court records and other official documents. And because we had the credit card slips, we figured that's a good piece of forensic evidence. So we took the handwriting samples to a handwriting expert that was being used by the U.S. Attorney's Office, who prosecutes all of our cases here in D.C. And he said that she was the one who signed the credit card slips. So we arrested her for credit card fraud. And during the interrogation that followed, she eventually confessed to having participated in the murder. And during that confession, she gave all of these details that, as we love to say, only the true killer would have known.
Only the true killer would know. Okay.
Right. I mean, that's a classic, one of the red flags that I'm always looking for right there. So, but we had other people, of course, who we thought participated in this case. We continued our investigation, which doesn't happen a lot in confession cases, because most times when you get the confession, case closed, you move on. But we were following up our investigation, and
can I interrupt you? Who was she to him?
We thought that they had a sexual relationship.
Okay.
Which turns out, of course, to be totally false. But during our follow-up, we found out that she had an alibi that was totally unshakable. And we tried. We tried every single theory to shake the alibi. So we realized that the foundation of our case was really now the handwriting expert. So we wanted to get other experts to look at it. So we went to the FBI and the Secret Service, and they both came back to us and they said, well, no way did this woman sign these credit card slips. And by the way, who is this expert that we're using? Because we never heard of him. Well, it turns out that he was not only a handwriting expert, but he was a fingerprint expert, a firearms expert, a tool mark expert. And I mean, it was just crazy. So the whole case fell apart. Well, I wanted to know, what did I do? What was it that I did in that interrogation room that convinced this woman that it was a good idea to confess to a crime that she didn't commit? Because, I'm not a yeller, I'm not a screamer. I'm, that interrogation, knowing what I know now, that interrogation would have passed muster in any courtroom here in this country. But also, how does she know all those details? Well, during that time period, the only recording that we would make of an interrogation is the final confession. That was the practice, back then. And a lot of agencies still do that. Fortunately for us, early on, she confessed to finding the credit cards. And we thought, okay, well, that's going to be our confession. We'll get that on tape. We did that, but then we let the tape run. And so we captured a large part of the rest of the interrogation. And in going back and looking at it critically, we began to see where, in very subtle ways, in little bits and pieces, we were providing her with the information about the case that over time she was able to incorporate into a confession that was plausible, at least enough to get her into court. We also, because of confirmation bias on our part, we were only looking for evidence that confirmed our theory that she did it. We ignored evidence that she didn't. We missed huge red flags that we should have picked up on that pointed to her innocence right there. So what I did was I said, this is a great training tool Law enforcement conferences, they always have people go up there and talk about their successes. You don't remember those. What you remember is when somebody talks about their failures. So what I wanted to do is take the lessons learned. And during this time, I was also reading the writings of people like Steve Drisson, Saul Kassin, and those folks, and learning about what it was that we did in the interrogation room that could lead somebody to believe that it's in their best interest to confess. And I created training for law enforcement, trying to help them. I'm sorry?
Was she convicted?
No. Once we found out that she had the alibi and that there was a false confession, she spent 9 months in jail.
She spent 9 months in jail. Okay.
Right. And I'll be honest with you, if we hadn't had that videotape, she probably, and if we hadn't done a follow-up investigation like we did, she probably either would have been convicted or more likely have pled guilty. Because, a confession is so powerful that it's one of the hardest things to get past. And even if you have overwhelming evidence of somebody's innocence, people just can't get it into their head that somebody might confess to a crime that they didn't commit. And so they go with the confession. But, then again, why would you confess to a crime that you did commit? I mean, both are equally stupid, right? So there's something that we do that causes that.
Right. And I told you before when I was going to have Steve Drisson as a guest, I read up on this and I saw a number of videos, and to watch Brendan Dassey, for one, in Making a Murderer. I mean, it's just so powerful the way he was coached, the way he was kind of, I'd say, coerced, the way he was taken advantage of. And, he at the time was 16 and he had a low IQ, and he was, here's a cop putting his hand on Brendan's knee and saying, you did this. We know you did it. Don't you want to get back to your mom? And he said, can I go back to school now?
Mm-hmm.
And he was just, and he lives in a jail. I mean, despite the fact that the the false confession seems so obvious, but again, I do think in the public mind, from what I've read, people tend to think that if somebody confesses, she did the deed. And
well, that was a normal, that's what we were actually taught. I mean, back in the day, no interrogation school ever conceded that anybody would confess to a crime that they didn't commit unless they were tortured or mentally ill. The Reed people have had to have come a long way over the last couple of decades because of all of the exonerations involving DNA that proved that false confessions do happen. However, they still teach that if you use their technique properly, you'll never get a false confession, even though the creator of the Reed technique got a false confession back in the 1950s himself. But it's funny because they said that one of the things that you should never do is, of course, use their tactics on an innocent person. So, I mean, but even though in their textbooks and on their website, they talk about some of the cautions and things along that line, when it comes to their classes that they teach in person, it's very seldom mentioned. And if it is, it's played down. And so, like the officers in the Brendan Dassey case, I promise you that they believe that was a valid confession.
yes.
And one of the reasons that they don't really understand how contamination works, because that confession was contaminated. He was fed the information. They were telling the story, not him. So you really can't tell whether or not the information came from him or from them.
Right.
But if you believe that nobody will confess to a crime that they didn't commit, then it doesn't matter how much information you feed them, because they'll never admit to it. They'll never say that I did it.
Right. in the Brendan Dassey case, what was also striking that when it went to a higher court, the judges were presuming what was going on psychologically. Now, I'm a psychotherapist, and I don't think I would easily presume, because one would have to know a lot more. And I think having a good psychological testing and profiling would have helped. But, some of the judges were actually heard to say Brendan Dassey was aching to admit his crime. And he got such a relief from confessing. And, that held him in a position that he's still there. And to me, this is also, I'm very glad that some of the investigative methods are changing. But there are people locked up, like this man, Tommy Ward, who's featured in the book and in the film on Netflix, let me say, The Innocent Man, has spent his youth, his life in prison. He is innocent. What comes out in the Netflix film, he's innocent. And it's known that he's innocent. But the DA's office is appealing, and they have insisted on keeping him in jail while the appeal goes on. And his mother, is
locked up again.
He's still locked up. As far as I know, when I spoke to Steve Drizin, he was never released. He's considered innocent, but the fact that the public does not know this, as in general, I think that there is a pathology in the larger culture that we have grown up with the difficulty of apologizing and admitting we're wrong. So when you look at some of these people, someone just got released recently after 43 years in prison without a dime to his name. And this is kind of shocking, because this is a national abuse. This is a human rights abuse. So it gets me a little crazy when we go to, let's say, a known dictatorship like China. And, we can say they have human rights abuses and we should boycott this and boycott that. And I think, well, how about we fix some of this stuff here? So that's just a soapbox for me, because when you see, I know when you see The Innocent Man, I know you've read the book, but when you see Tommy Ward, heart goes out to him.
But the thing about it is God knows how many cases I've reviewed, and I've made the comment that after a while, all you got to do is switch out the names and the dates and the locations, and the fact pattern remains the same. Yeah. We make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And it's only recently that we've begun to study not only what we do as detectives that can lead to a false confession, but also or bad eyewitness identification or anything along that line. And before I go any further, also realize that the same interrogation techniques that we use that can lead to false confessions, we will use them on a witness who we think is lying to us. So, and witness perjury or false witness statements is even a higher cause of wrongful convictions. But we're now just beginning to better understand how there are so many other factors that can contribute. Like I was talking about confirmation bias. When you're at a point where you truly believe this theory and all you're doing is looking for evidence that confirms it rather than testing your theory like a scientist would. We're looking at organizational factors, the fact that our police organizations are more worried about quantity than quality. They're under pressure to close these. Detectives are under enormous pressure to keep their closure rates up. And getting a confession is a quick and easy way to close a case out. But there's also situational factors too. You know, outside media pressure, things like that. All of these things contribute. And we're finally beginning to see how it all fits together. But unlike the UK, that's done a lot, has progressed a lot in this area, we have 18,000 different police departments. And, you know, we have to convince each and every one to change their ways one at a time. And that takes a lot of doing.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little about what you do now?
What I do now is basically I do a lot of teaching. I still teach law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, you know, college students. I work with the Innocence Projects. I do mostly case consultations where in both pending cases and in post-conviction work, where I review the case, I review the investigative process that occurred, and I try to determine if there was any problems with it, especially when it comes to the confession or statement evidence. And I help the attorneys identify problems with the reliability of the confessions themselves. So, I mean, where I might just be looking, people might expect me just to look at the interrogation in the confession. Actually, I look at the entire investigation because, of course, the first step in getting a false confession or a wrongful conviction is you identify the wrong person as a suspect. So the first thing I want to know is how did this person become a suspect to begin with? And if it's based on pseudoscience like we were taught to use, yeah, a lot of our suspects are actually identified as suspects based on what they call behavioral analysis. It's a process that's taught in these interrogation classes where they teach you that if you study a person's body language, if you listen to the way they answer questions, they even have a list of 17 questions that you can ask the person, and based on their answers, you can determine whether or not they're being deceptive or even if they're guilty. And so, however, you know, the schools that teach this claim that it has over 80% accuracy. Decades and decades of research has shown that it's no more than flip of a coin and that it's total pseudoscience. It doesn't work. In fact, the people who created it admit that it's not based on any scientific research whatsoever. So, you know, we're deciding who's guilty, who we're going to interrogate based on stuff like that. And if that's how they were identified, then we have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is striking to me when I read some of this stuff is that even after there's DNA evidence or after there's no evidence, it's very difficult for the law enforcement people, at least from what I've seen, to give up the kind of certainty that they have. So, for instance, Steve Drizin worked with a guy who was, a completely tragic case named Billy Wayne Cope. And he, he found his daughter, 11-year-old daughter, raped and killed. And the law enforcement people assumed that it had to be him. So they arrested him. And I believe he was interviewed 650 times to the point that he lost sight of his own innocence. I mean, he kind of went cuckoo. He was driven mad in a way. And then they found a person with the right DNA, with the matching DNA. And they decided that there's no way that that man could have known about this house and could have gotten in and raped this girl. And it had to be the father who opened the door and witnessed all of this. So they kept him in jail, and his wife never knew. She died before she knew about the DNA. So I think like maybe she didn't know if her husband was guilty. And then he ultimately died in jail of a massive heart attack, you know, before he could get liberated. But here's the, you know, you think, I mean, you could think a racial bias because it's, you know, the Deep South, but the guy was white and the law enforcement were white, and the guy with the DNA was African American. So it was definitely not that. But it was like this assumption. And I guess what would you call that? When the confirmation bias, is that, it's like,
That's a large part of it, but it's also ego. There's also the fear of liability, because you know, once you admit that you're wrong, then you open yourself up for all sorts of lawsuits and things along that line.
can you explain,
And
Jim,
but all of that plays a part.
can you explain that? What kind of liability is there?
Well, I testified in several civil suits um, involving, you know, false confessions and wrongful convictions, where, you know, the person is awarded millions of dollars because of the failure for law enforcement to take the appropriate investigative steps to where they ignored evidence that proved the person's innocence. Sometimes they would hide the evidence to prove their innocence. You know, and also this boils down to part of the culture of law enforcement too. You know, that thin blue line thing that they always talk about. You know, we're the only thing between you and the bad guys. And there's a term for it. It's called noble cause corruption. And it's basically, you know, this is a bad guy. You know it in your heart. You're not going to let him get away. And so you're going to do what you have to do, even if it means doing the wrong thing, because you're doing it for the right reason. And so that's why, you know, officers will sometimes mistestify, or as they like to say, test a lie, where they don't quite, you know, tell the truth on the stand, or they actually out and out lie. Or they hide evidence, or they hide documents, or they choose not to document something simply because they know it's going to cause them problems later on in court. And part of that issue is that we don't have we're not really very well trained, in my opinion, in our legal and ethical obligations when it comes to this sort of thing. And I mean, we're really lacking in that area right there. But just as an example, I was testifying down at the Florida Innocence Commission, and this was a commission that was set up to develop best practices to avoid wrongful convictions. And it was being televised. It was judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, you know, cops, all were on the commission. And my purpose was to convince them, believe it or not, convince them that mandatory videotaping was a good idea. So, and I did that the other day in South Dakota. There's still places that don't mandate it. So I have a list of reasons on my PowerPoint why cops don't want to mandate videotaping. And I'm going through explaining each one away. And as I'm doing that, and I keep forgetting the name. There's a state of Florida law enforcement agency, Florida, whatever, but it covers the entire state as an investigative group. And the head of that agency raised his hand and said, you know, my detectives come to me all the time with this one reason why we shouldn't videotape that's not up there. I go, okay, well, what is it? He says, well, if you interview or interrogate somebody and they tell you several different stories, if it's videotaped, we got to turn all that over. All we want to turn over is the last version, the best, because the other stuff would just muddy up the waters. And I'm thinking, you're telling me on live TV that your detectives break the law and hide evidence that might help the person. You know, how do I respond to that? But that's the whole thing. We don't have a good understanding of what our moral and ethical obligations are, and really what our true role is. Our true role is not to play, you know, judge and jury. Our true role is to impartially gather the evidence, and that's it.
So I have a question as you're talking. What kind of pressure is there on people in law enforcement who kind of want to do the right thing, but they're surrounded by people who are bowing to the pressure of not?
Um, it is an awful lot of pressure. It is a tremendous amount of pressure. You know, not only from your supervisors, but also from your coworkers as
Yeah.
well. They begin not to trust you. Um, just as an example, I was involved as part of my work with the DC Police Department. I ran a project where we were reviewing old cases and cold cases and stuff. And part of my responsibility was handling requests from defense attorneys for old documents and things. And I actually found some evidence in a very old rape murder case that was used to exonerate the person.
Oh.
Um, and I was actually working with the defense and I was working with the prosecutor on this case. And when I was notified by the prosecutor that, hey, you better let your people know in a couple of weeks, we're expecting to have an exoneration in this case because it looks like the DNA is going to come back to somebody else. So I typed up a memo to my bosses saying, this is what's going on. This looks really good for us because we're the ones who found the evidence and all of that. Hit send. 30 seconds later, I get a phone call from a very high ranking official basically asking me, who told you to work on this case? And I said, that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to be doing here. And so after that, I got a lot of resistance from other detectives who didn't want me anywhere near their cases. I was one of the biggest supporters of videotaping at my department. And the result was that my nickname became, let's say, Benedict Trainum, because because I didn't toe the company line. And there's a lot of good officers out there who want to do it.
I'm sorry, can you say what your nickname was?
A Benedict Trainum, as in Benedict Arnold.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. But no, there's a lot of good officers out there who want to do the right thing and who want to have the best investigations possible and all of that. And there's a lot of good police departments that are open to that sort of thing. However, you still meet the resistance that why did you testify to that? All you had to say is that you didn't remember, and we would have gotten a conviction. That sort of thing.
Yeah. So, do you have any suggestions about how the public can get educated about this stuff? Wrongful convictions, false
Well,
confessions.
I mean, there is so much out there these days. Um, One of the things that we really need to do is, of course, educate not so much the public, but law enforcement itself. And I'm proud to say, like with the wrongful conviction case that I helped in the exoneration, where the older detectives were, very much turned against me. The younger ones were like, "Hey, that's great. You really made us look good," that sort of thing. But they've been more exposed to the idea that these things can happen because of podcasts, because of Netflix and other documentaries and things along that line. Um, there's been a small movement, but it's growing in law enforcement to actually change the way that we do interrogations, to follow the lead that they did in the UK and throw out all of those interrogation tactics that we've been taught over the years, like lying about the evidence, presenting reasons why you may have committed the crime, and all this other kind of stuff, things that are very coercive, and doing it a totally different way that actually not only gets confessions, but gets you better confessions and more evidence about the case as well. That's where I think a large amount of the focus should be. But the thing about it is that I have been taught time and time and time again that law enforcement doesn't change unless they're embarrassed by the media, by politicians, and they're forced to. One of the things that is also occurring right now, which really needs to take place more and more, is every time you have a wrongful conviction, there needs to be a comprehensive review of that entire of everybody's actions who played a part in that.
Right.
It's called a sentinel event review. And it's the same thing that they do in hospitals if there's a mistake or if an airplane crashes. They look at everybody's actions and how they contributed to this. And then they come up with ideas on how to prevent this from happening again. But unfortunately, in these cases where there is a wrongful conviction and it's been confirmed, law enforcement just closes ranks and they won't discuss it. And partially because they're afraid of libels, of civil suits and things along that line. But we don't learn from our mistakes. And if we do these things and we make it public, then not only do we learn from our mistakes, but the public now knows that they need to help us change in order to do things better.
The other thing is that the victim's family is very often, it seems, not helped.
You're right, and that is a great point, because so often, we're looking at the person who's being exonerated and we don't think about what this is doing to the victims' families. Like maybe in a rape case, the victim made an identification and it turns out to have been the wrong person. And so then a lot of blame is placed on them when they're just as much a victim of the system as the wrongfully convicted person is. Now, there are organizations out there that are trying to help support them, but still, the other issue is that you're a victim. Either you or you're a victim yourself, or you have a family member who's a victim, and suddenly you're confronted by, hey, they're challenging this conviction. This person may have been wrongfully convicted. Who do you turn to for information? You typically turn to the prosecutor's office and the police, who are going to tell you, oh, this is all BS. They're just using some kind of trickery. And all that does is it adds to your trauma. And we really need to have people who are independent, like the victim advocates who are independent of those organizations, in order to help the person work through what's going on with the process and help them cope better, I think, than we have. There are organizations out there, but they're not widespread.
Well, in the Brendan Dassey case, you see on Netflix, I'm just doing advertising for Netflix here, but you see in Making a Murderer, the victim's family and how they are so warmly united with the prosecutors. And it feels like then the prosecuting attorneys and the law enforcement and the people who run for office, all sort of in cahoots, really not helping the family to know that maybe something's up in the air and they can get behind getting to the truth rather than getting that, again, confirmation bias maybe, rather than getting that person in jail forever or even killed.
There's a case out in Norfolk, Virginia called the Norfolk Four. And if anybody gets interested, they had a great website. I think they still do. But there was also a Netflix documentary on them. Or Ken Burns. Ken Burns did a documentary,
Oh, okay.
I believe, on them. And these were four sailors who confessed to the rape and murder of a woman. And of course, the DNA, none of the confessions matched. What they said was physically impossible to have happened. Lots of stuff going on there. And they actually had DNA from another person who was a confirmed rapist. But they stayed in jail for many, many, many more years than they should have, mainly because the family was so convinced of their guilt that it made it difficult for the governor to take that political step and say, no, they're innocent, based on all this information right there. And of course, it's because the family and the police department and the prosecutor were all like in the Dassey case, were all, you're very, very close, and they were kind of feeding off each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then, when you hear some of the, evidence, or you hear some of the testimony, you go, we want to give peace to this family. And so it becomes a kind of, I don't know, it's almost like talking about the victims of 9/11 and their families, which obviously is a crucially important factor to consider, but it doesn't mean that torture is okay. So it's like, the people who have been responsible or been at the top of some of the military torture, are still defending it. We are helping and defending the right and the dignity of those people who are the family members of, our Americans who were killed. So we don't have to look at the other part. And, like, one of the things I'm thankful to you personally is that you told me about Jennifer Thompson.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could tell me if you have any experience in restorative justice, because I think that's a kind of fascinating field where victims and convicted people, rightly or wrongly, at some point get together and have a series of forgiveness. And she has a great line in her book called Picking Cotton, where she says, forgiveness is not excusing. It's just letting go of the power over ourselves as well, of just hating.
No, I have known Jennifer for quite some time, and I have a lot of respect for her work and all of that. And just, I've dealt a lot, especially in working cold cases and doing case reviews and all that. I dealt a lot with the victims of unsolved cases. In a lot of ways, their concerns, their pain, and things along that line are similar to what Jennifer's clients are experiencing. And what I found is that if people are just honest with them, and if, just acknowledging their loss, and the fact that, we're never going to be able to make this up to you. There really is no closure, because people think things are going to come back to normal, and it really doesn't. But then again, there's my own experience with the woman who I sent to jail for 9 months. That was part of a NPR series where they actually found her and they interviewed her, and then we spoke after that. And there was a lot of things that had happened in her life that I wasn't aware of, that I could actually have helped with if I knew of it, like helping her get her case expunged. And there was a lot of things, a lot of questions that she had about the case, and why I did what I did. And I, of course, tried to explain it to the best of my ability. But there was a lot of things that about this, my actions and about her arrest, that had impacted her life. Of course, it's going to impact very severely your life and all that. But one of the things was that the arrest was still being held against her for, like, looking for jobs and things along that line, even though, since she wasn't convicted, it shouldn't have been. So I got a lawyer to attempt to help her get it expunged. I reached out to other people who were offering help and all of that. But then again, what happened was the liability issue popped up. And rather than, go that route, I think she got an attorney, and she was going to sue the city and sue myself. And at that point, the other offers of help dropped off the table because they didn't want to get involved. I think if I had somebody like Jennifer's organization who could have had people there to counsel her one-on-one and kind of help her through this process, that she would have it would have gone much smoother for her.
Right.
She eventually did get the case expunged, so she no longer has an arrest record.
That's good.
But it was a very rocky process that need not have been that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to say anything more about Jennifer because I'm going to have her as a guest. So
Yeah, I mean, she's a great person. Yeah. Good.
thank you for that introduction. I think that we can stop here.
Okay.
James Trainum, Jim Trainum, I really want to thank you because I think your honesty and your own work has been so helpful. And I hope it's really moving to change a culture. And I hope as a private citizen that the public gets a little more interested because, I know Dostoevsky said a society can be judged by how we treat our prisoners. And, he's not living in this time, but how we treat our prisoners in general is not so great, the mass incarceration. And this movement of false confession and conviction is really crucial. And I thank you for getting behind it,
Well, something else that I just would like to bring up. I was at a conference in Texas for judges and prosecutors and cops on their role in preventing wrongful convictions. And there was a chief, I don't remember what agency he was from, but he was a keynote speaker. And he said, law enforcement's job is very, very simple. You want to get the right guy, but you want to do it the right way. And it's when you deviate from the right way that we have problems. And there's a lot of law enforcement officers, investigators out there who want to do it the right way, but a lot of times they don't know what the right way is. And that's where we need to encourage them and educate them and let them know that, when you do it the right way, you might not always win, but justice will be done.
I think the implication there is hopefully people will have increasing courage and support to get it done the right way, even if they started the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
Because, recuperating from mistakes is just something that's human that we need to do. And it's very hard to admit that. But sometimes, the road can be changed.
It absolutely can. Like I said, if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're just going to do them all over again. So.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, thank you. Take care.
Take care.